welcome to yet another edition of E-Expressions with the New Indian Express. I have with me one of India's premier microbiologists and vaccine scientists. She was one of a team that led the research that led to the rotavirus vaccine. And we'll see what are the lessons in that we could actually use for the corona vaccine. But we have so many questions to ask her. And I think she's quite used to being at the receiving end of a litany of questions. So hello and welcome, Dr. Kang. Thank you so much for being with us. I know you're very, very busy, but it's a privilege to have you with us.
Pleasure to talk to you, Kaveri.
So I'll get into it right away, Dr. Kang. You know, it's been over 6 months since the coronavirus hit the globe. What are the things that we have learned from how it functions that can help us going forward?
I think one of the things that we've learned is that in many ways, this virus behaves in a predictable fashion. There are a few new things that we have found out about the widespread systemic effects of the virus. But by and large, this virus is behaving like most RNA viruses that cause infections in humans. It's behaving like most viruses that cause mucosal infections. So in terms of infectious disease researchers, we have a lot of lessons that we've learned from other viral infections that we can apply here for both transmission as well as for disease. So public health and clinical management, both can be done better by taking lessons from other viruses.
Yet this is far deadlier.
Actually, no.
Okay.
This virus does not kill a lot of people that it infects. And this is something that I keep bringing up. The numbers are scary.
Yeah.
The numbers are scary because of how infectious this virus is.
Right.
But if you have an infection, the one thing that is very clear from India, from other parts of the world, is that not everybody is going to get severely ill and not everybody who is infected will die.
That's right.
In fact, it's a lot less deadly than the other coronaviruses that we have seen and dealt with.
Right.
We had SARS, and SARS had an almost 10% mortality rate. MERS, which is still with us, has an almost 30% mortality rate. Here we are talking about less than 1%.
Yeah.
So the numbers are scary because of the number of infections being so much larger.
Right.
But in terms of mortality, it's actually a lot less. The thing that we need to worry about here and why this is dangerous for public health and for people is the unpredictability. How do you know which person, when infected, is going to go into severe disease? We already have some clues about risk factors, age, comorbidities. This we know. But why does a young person do badly when 20 other people around them, the same age, the same situation, have an asymptomatic infection?
Right.
That's because it's not just the virus, it's also the host. And we don't understand what it is about some hosts that makes them react differently to the virus than others. There are signals, but we don't have a complete understanding of what is going on. Not even a partial understanding, actually.
Not even 6 months, over 6 months after we've seen the disease in operation in so many places?
So the bulk of disease we understand.
Right.
A lot of infections are asymptomatic. A lot of people will have very mild symptoms. Almost everybody will recover from the infection. This is a respiratory virus, gets into the lungs, makes breathing difficult. All of this we understand, so that's good. The things that we don't understand is why do some young people develop very severe disease? What kinds of treatments are likely to help? We've already seen that suppression of inflammation in severe disease matters. That's why dexamethasone or any steroid becomes an effective treatment. We've seen that oxygenation matters throughout. In fact, we pick up that people are hypoxic,
Right.
lacking oxygen at quite a late stage. So,
Right.
screening for hypoxia is very important. But because the numbers of infections are so high, what we are seeing, the bits that we don't understand, are actually relatively rare events happening in a small percentage of people. But because they are so severe, we'd like to have a better handle on how to manage them. And there is where we don't necessarily have answers as yet.
And one of the really scary things, doctor, is the fact that that in a lot of cases in India, people have gone too late to actually get proper treatment because of perhaps lack of access to healthcare, and that worries me, especially in the rural areas. Now that it will, if please correct me if I'm wrong, it will get into the rural areas with a lot of this reverse migration happening.
So the virus is already in the rural
Yeah.
areas, and we're seeing more transmission happening there. But you're absolutely right. In the Indian healthcare system, we have not been able to deliver the kind of emergency care
Yes.
that we should be able to provide. And in addition, for this particular virus, there has been so much misinformation, so much worry about what happens to individuals, their families, their communities if they are infected, that people are reluctant to be tested. And if they do fall ill, they don't want to come to a hospital. That means that when they actually arrive at a hospital, they are much sicker. We could have dealt better with disease if we had caught them earlier. And I hope going forward, this is what we will communicate to people. If you're not well, you need to come to a facility where you can be managed. The rapid deteriorations that happen need to be managed in hospitals.
The other scary thing, doctor, is the fact that it could actually leave you with permanent damage to the heart and lungs, even if you recover. That
Yeah.
is of concern, isn't it?
For many infectious diseases, this does happen. There are long-term sequelae that are usually an autoimmune reaction that follows the viral infection. It can happen with some bacteria, it happens with viruses. For example, you see people with arthritis after an infectious episode with certain kinds of bacteria and certain kinds of viruses. You see Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a paralysis that can happen with many kinds of viral infections. So this is not unusual that when you have a viral infection, you see the effects lasting for a long time. What I'd be interested in knowing, which I don't know yet, is does this virus actually go and hide somewhere?
Hmm.
And this happens with many other viruses, cytomegalovirus, for example, many of the herpes viruses infect you the first time, and then they can go into a latent stage where the reactivation might result in disease. We
Hmm.
don't know whether that happens with this virus or not, and we will find out over time.
Right. So let's get to the vaccine, which everyone is so concerned about, and everyone thinks it's like the magic bullet. It may not be, as you have said repeatedly, because even if we do discover it, how will it be disseminated? How will it be, how will it reach out to the maximum number of people? There are a whole lot of questions. Let's begin with the question of when do you think such a vaccine will come about, which I'm sure you've been asked so many times. You yourself were working on it, weren't you, Doctor?
So, while I was at the
Yes.
Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, there were scientists there who were working on vaccines, and I had supported them to establish a laboratory that will support the development of vaccines. So, that I think both of those are important. not just developing a vaccine, but supporting development of other vaccines.
Right.
So that is happening in multiple places in the country. But I think if we think about what's going to happen with vaccines, I think we will see results from interim analyses that will come out sometime this year. We've only got 3 months left to
Yes.
this year, and I'm anticipating that at least 3 or 4 of the vaccines that are in phase 3 trials will give us some interim results. We will know whether those vaccines are going to work or not. If we are lucky and one or more of those vaccines have good results, then it is likely that we will have a vaccine, you know, possible that a few doses might be available this year, but really at the start of 2021. But having the vaccine and having enough of the vaccine, having distribution of the vaccine are all multiple things that need to be done in order to have wider public health use. So I don't think that's going to happen at any kind of reasonable scale until the middle of next year, if not later. Also,
Just,
as you pointed out, sorry,
yeah, please.
that vaccines are not going to be the magic
Yeah.
bullets. And there are multiple reasons for that.
Yes. In fact, let's go into that because there are two aspects to it. One is, of course, that the vaccine itself, we don't know what the side effects will be. There are a lot of people who are saying, let's be 100% sure and then go ahead. I think you are of the belief that let's just go ahead and then let's see. So there are two schools of thought to that, if I'm not mistaken. That's one. And the second is, of course, the vaccine itself. There's a certain amount of political pressure to get it out in various countries, not just in India. How do we balance this political pressure and scientific ethics and maintaining that integrity?
So one thing to remember is that the vaccine is not going to be a perfect vaccine. Certainly not the first generation vaccine. So if you look at where WHO, the FDA, and now the DCGI have said how well a vaccine needs to work, they're saying that the vaccine needs to prevent disease in 50% of the people who have been vaccinated. The vaccine needs to have 50% efficacy,
Right.
right? So that's not a perfect vaccine in and of itself. We may find that it's actually 70 or 80% efficacious. I doubt very much that we're going to find any vaccine for a mucosal infection that is 100% efficacious. So if you have a vaccine that is 70 or 80% efficacious or 50% efficacious, it still has value.
Right.
It's going to decrease disease in the population by 50%. And that means if you have that many people who are vaccinated, plus ones in whom the vaccine fails and they develop infections, you're getting that much closer to herd immunity. So I definitely don't think we should wait for a perfect vaccine, but I do think we should wait for clinical efficacy results, which means testing vaccines in thousands of people, not hundreds, and generating safety data from those people. Now, once we have that safety data, safety monitoring does not stop when the vaccine trial ends and the vaccine is licensed. Once the vaccines start to be used in people, we need to continue the safety monitoring. That's called pharmacovigilance or surveillance for adverse events following immunizations, and that's absolutely essential for any new vaccine.
Doctor, there's been some concern about the side effects in the trials that have happened, especially I think the AstraZeneca trial. I think there's a sense that maybe one of the people who was injected
Yeah.
with it got paralysis, and that, of course, caused a lot of panic. So, what do you know of some of these things that are happening?
So if one of the things to remember is that people who are in vaccine trials have other things happen to them.
Oh, right.
You could get hit by a bus,
Right.
right? That's not a side effect of the
Right.
vaccine. You could develop a liver infection.
Right.
You could develop a neurological finding.
Right.
These things can happen and they may be coincidental
Right.
and not correlated with the vaccine.
Right.
So that relationship, the causal relationship between the vaccine and the side effect needs to be proved.
Right.
That cannot be proved by one person having a certain illness, right? So cause and effect need to be defined.
Right.
And in this case, it was not shown that the vaccine led to the transverse myelitis. However, what will happen now, exactly the right things happened. The trial was stopped. The
Right.
DSMB looked at the data. The DSMB said, go ahead, but warn people that they may have neurological side effects, and if they have them, they must report them as quickly as possible so that these can be investigated. That's the way trials work. We don't expect a vaccine to be 100%
Right.
safe. There are always side effects, even if it's redness, swelling, and fever
Yeah.
because you got an injection or something more rare. It's entirely possible that there may be neurological effects. We just don't know that this event was related to that vaccine.
What are the lessons from the rotavirus vaccine that you developed, Dr. Kang, which we can use in developing this vaccine?
So I think one, let's start with safety because that's what
Yeah.
we were talking
Yeah.
about. Rotavirus vaccines have been associated with intussusception.
Mm.
The first rotavirus vaccine that was licensed was actually withdrawn because of an association with intussusception.
Okay.
So then really large trials were done, 60, 70,000 infants. And in them, no association with intussusception was found, and the vaccines came into public health use.
Doctor,
After
sorry to stop you, but what is interception?
intussusception is a telescoping of the gut, of one section of the gut into another. So
Okay.
if you think about a glove, and if you push the finger of the glove back inside to where the palm is, that's what intussusception looks
Okay.
like.
Okay.
So sometimes when that happens, when the one part of the intestine goes inside another part, it can get stuck, the blood supply can be
That's dangerous.
compromised. It can lead to gangrene of the gut. It can lead to septicemia and death.
Oh.
If you pick it up early, it can be sorted out by something as simple as giving the child an enema,
Okay.
because that water going in essentially
Right.
pushes the
This
stuck
is
bit out,
right.
right? So that can be done.
Right.
But intussusception is quite common without rotavirus vaccine also, but this association with intussusception was seen in the first week after the first dose of the rotavirus vaccine. So it became possible to make that
Right.
association between the side effect and the vaccine.
Hmm.
Now, this was found after the big trials had been done and when the vaccine was in public health use.
Oh.
First reported from Australia and then from other parts of the world. And it seems pretty clear that every rotavirus vaccine that we have most likely will cause this kind of side effect. Now,
Right.
the side effect happens in 1 in 20,000 to 1 in 100,000 vaccinated children. There was no way you could pick up an effect like that when you studied it only in 30, 40, 50,000 kids. You needed to immunize hundreds of thousands of children to be able to measure this effect. Now, because intussusception is treatable, the world has gone ahead with rotavirus vaccination, saying, here is a side effect we know about, we know it's handleable. So in the first week of after any dose of rotavirus vaccine, be very careful if your child is crying or has a red stool or has a lump in the abdomen, please bring them into a facility.
Right.
It's rare, but it happens. So
Right.
learning that lesson that when you think about risk and benefit,
Right.
you save many more lives
Right.
because children don't die of diarrhea than any child dying of intussusception.
Right. Right.
So, you need to do that risk benefit analysis, and that will be important for SARS-CoV-2 vaccines if we find that any of them has a side effect.
Right.
The second thing that's important to remember is that vaccines for mucosal infections are never going to be perfect vaccines. What usually happens when you have a vaccine for a mucosal infection is the vaccine works better against more severe disease.
Oh.
So it won't protect against infection, but it will protect against severe disease.
Right.
That's been seen in influenza vaccines, it's been seen in rotavirus vaccines. You can still be infected, but you won't develop symptoms. If you do develop symptoms, they will be much less severe than you would otherwise have had. So with SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, I think we are likely to see a similar disease prevention primacy to the results.
Right. Doctor, I was just thinking, I was talking to another scientist recently, and it occurred to me that even 30 years after HIV, we still haven't found a vaccine for that, and millions of dollars have been spent on it. So, is there a possibility that we could actually not have a vaccine at all for COVID?
It's entirely possible that we may not have a vaccine for COVID, but not for the same reasons as for HIV.
Okay.
So with SARS-CoV-2, even though, until we have a vaccine, we don't have a vaccine.
Yeah.
Right? So it's possible that every vaccine trial that we do might fail. But I think what we will find is, given how much this virus resembles other viruses, we will have a successful vaccine. We've tried so many different approaches. I'm pretty optimistic that something is going to work.
Hmm.
Now, how well it will work, how long protection will last, that we will discover once we have the vaccine.
Right.
But I think it's very important for people to understand that HIV, we didn't have a vaccine because HIV is a virus that actually infects immune cells.
Right.
It destroys the immune system, which is not what we are seeing with this virus. It sets up autoimmunity, but it doesn't actively go and infect the cells that make up the adaptive immune system.
Right.
But one thing it's very important to emphasize to people is how much of a payoff there has been by investing in vaccines for HIV.
Right.
So many of the technologies that we are using today to develop new vaccines actually came because people were working on HIV vaccines and it was so hard. They tried so many ways of doing it. So, for example, this effort now to stabilize the spike protein of coronavirus,
Right.
because we think that stabilization is important to make a vaccine, is something that was learned from HIV.
Right.
Structural virology really matters.
Doctor, the other remarkable thing actually about this, the development of the vaccine has been the global collaboration. We've seen an extraordinary amount of global collaboration. How has that been? Because you've been part of so many so many of these, and you're also a member of whose advisory committee on vaccine safety, if I'm not mistaken. So, how is this happening?
So the organization, I'm of course very proud to be associated with the WHO in any shape or form. And I chaired the immunization technical advisory group for CRO.
Right.
But the organization I'm proudest to be associated with is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations that was set up precisely for this.
Right.
It was established after Ebola,
Hmm.
and the idea was, can we be prepared for outbreaks of disease? And CEPI was the first organization to fund any programs
Right.
for vaccine development. CEPI now has 9 programs, and 8 of them are already in clinical development. The
Okay.
front runners that we see today were, most of them have some association with CEPI funding
Right.
the most risky part of vaccine development. And now CEPI is part of COVAX, the facility that is looking at what is the process so that vaccines can be made available to countries whether they have the funding to pay for them or not. One of the foundational principles of CEPI is equitable access, and I have chaired the Equitable Access Committee for CEPI from the beginning. Our goal has been always anything that CEPI invests in must be made available to the world without worrying about whether a particular country can afford to pay for vaccine or not. And the COVAX facility reflects those aspirational goals of CEPI.
So, and that's quite remarkable. Is it entirely philanthropic or is it a government initiative as well? How has something like this come about, and is there a model in it for public healthcare, for the public healthcare system in India?
So I think CEPI is part of the COVAX facility. It's leading that with Gavi. So
Right.
CEPI is focusing on the vaccine development, and Gavi will worry about the vaccine purchase and deployment.
Right.
And WHO is responsible for developing the allocation framework by which vaccines will be distributed to different countries. But the ACT Accelerator, or the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, is not just about vaccines. It's also about diagnostics and drugs.
Right.
And we've never seen the world come together like this to address an infectious disease.
Right.
WHO tried to do this with H1N1, and it didn't really work. There weren't this number of partners at the table. And it's very challenging
Hmm.
to get people on the same page, but that seems to have happened. It's really a remarkable effort from institutions, individuals, organizations, and countries
Right.
dealing with all of this. Now, what will happen in terms of the COVAX facility and getting vaccines to people is a model which is quite complicated financially, because you need to be able to tell companies that we are committing to buying vaccines from you. How do you do that without having money available?
Yeah.
So there are these very innovative structures that have been set up where Gavi uses some of its resources, but richer countries that sign up to the COVAX facility can make a commitment in 2 ways. They say, we will buy vaccine for ourselves, and we can do this by either paying now and committing to this cost, this range of costs, or we will commit to buying later, but we will commit to a slightly higher price range there. So if they pay up front, that money can be used to give to companies as their advance market commitment.
Right.
In addition to this, countries also have their overseas development budgets that they can contribute to this, so that with that money, vaccines can be bought for poorer countries.
Right.
So there are multiple mechanisms at play here, but the idea is to maximize the number of doses that can be made available for the world. And the goal is 2 billion doses by the end of 2021.
Right. Where is India currently in this race to develop the vaccine? Because we heard first that, oh, we'll have it by mid August. As of course, in America, President Trump says by October we're going to have the vaccine, just in time for his re-election, I presume. But here also, then we heard that no, we'll have it only by 2021. Your committee itself was disbanded, which I think must have been a little heartbreaking. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but how close are we to developing it in India?
At the moment, we need phase 3 clinical trials, and the trial that is being done by AstraZeneca is in 1,600 individuals. So that's, while it is labeled a phase 2-3 trial, it's not really going to give us significant clinical efficacy results. So
Right.
our best hope really is that AstraZeneca will have clinical efficacy data from the trials that it's doing outside of India. It will have immunogenicity data from the trial that is being done within India. And that whole package, if everything looks good, will lead to licensure in India. That I see as our fastest way of getting a vaccine in the country. The other two vaccines that are in clinical trials, the Zycov-D from Zydus Cadila and the Covaxin from Bharat Biotech, will both need to generate clinical efficacy data, which means they have to vaccinate enough people and have compare them to unvaccinated people to show that the vaccine prevents 50% of symptomatic infections. That will take a while.
Do you want to address your own efforts, which were suddenly stopped?
I think the committee didn't really last very long, and I'm not privy to the decisions that are made in the government about why certain committees should be formed or dissolved. I think we can see from both ICMR and the Department of Biotechnology that both of them are offering a lot of support to vaccine companies that are developing vaccines, as well as to some academic efforts. So it doesn't matter really who's giving advice or who's leading a committee as long as the work is getting done.
Right. Spoken like a true scientist. You don't let politics interfere in your work. But um, uh, the fact is that we have to live with this. Is that so? We have to learn to live with this virus, even if we do get a vaccine.
I think that's going to be the case. Whenever you have a virus that causes asymptomatic infections, as this one does, then you're not going to be able to identify every infection unless you have an effort of the kind that we have had for polio.
Right.
Vaccinate the world many, 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 many times.
Right.
And I think eradicating disease may be something that we would think about many years in the future. All, this kind of disease that is restricted to humans. And well, it's not really restricted to humans because we know that we can give it to animals and get
Right.
it from animals. But potentially it is something that we could eradicate. But the time and effort that it would take, the resources that it would take, I'm not sure that we necessarily have the bandwidth to think about that now.
Doctor, how did you get into this field? And did you ever imagine that there would be a contagion of this sort that would grip the world and, set it completely, just stop the world?
So this is something anybody who deals with virology
Yeah.
and particularly deals with species transmission. Rotavirus also, by the way, can be transmitted from animals to humans and
Oh, really?
humans to animals.
Okay.
We don't, until we study it, we don't know how frequently it happens.
Hmm.
A lot of people started out this with blaming China
Yeah.
and saying because they eat exotic
Yeah.
species. But you could easily have a virus that hops over from your pet dog or your cat or, from a cow and establish itself in humans and spread. So it's not restricted to exotic animals. It's just that they have a variety more of viruses that haven't been studied. So we expected this. In fact, this is not as bad as it could have been. I
Really?
know it sounds kind of uh, not appropriate to say that, but a really bad influenza might have been worse than this.
Right.
Remember, again, this is a virus that is showing us less than 1% mortality.
Right.
If you
Right.
look at infection fatality rates, they're likely to come down somewhere around that. Could have been way, way worse than this. So I don't think we are done yet with outbreaks.
Right. Doctor, do we know exactly what caused it? Do we still know? There's still, those conspiracy theories, and of course, there's the wet market theory. Do we know for sure?
I don't think we know for sure. I know that there are ongoing efforts to try and figure out what the source is. We do know that it was in bats for a while, but the link from bats to humans
Hmm.
and what intervening species there might have been has not been elucidated as yet.
Hmm.
If we keep looking and looking at scale, we may find it or we may never know.
But just that personal question, when you went into this field, uh, did you imagine that this would happen? I know you're saying it could have been far worse, but even then, did you ever imagine it would be so bad?
I think if you read the history of the influenza
Influenza,
epidemic,
yeah. Yeah. That
it
was what,
tells
11
you,
million people, right? The Spanish flu?
yeah.
Yeah.
So if you read about history and you recognize that for viruses, we don't have treatments.
Right.
For most bacteria, we do have some antibiotic or the other, but we have very few antivirals.
Hmm.
So until we get a way of treating infections or preventing infections, we will wind up with not being able to handle many kinds of outbreaks. In fact, one of the most exciting things and what I hope will come out of this epidemic is our ability to very rapidly make antibodies to the virus
Hmm.
and use those as treatments. So now there is a lot of discussion around, can we make monoclonal antibodies and give them to people early in illness so that they don't progress to severe disease,
Which will be in the form of drugs.
which is in the form of drugs. These trials are already ongoing. Regeneron and Eli Lilly have trials that are ongoing. There are other companies, small biotechs and large companies, that are looking at making more monoclonal antibodies. So I think for therapy, those would be a good way to go. But the fact that the technology allows you to very rapidly come up with a treatment once you know what the virus is,
Right.
I think will help us handle future outbreaks much better.
So, almost the last question. What are the lessons for India's healthcare from this, which you feel we really urgently need to fix?
I think we need to fix surveillance and testing.
Hmm.
Now, we've said this often enough for infectious diseases that it's very important to measure what you have.
Right.
And without having a good surveillance system, it's impossible to understand what the burden of disease is. It should not be a requirement, as we've seen now, to build a whole new surveillance system every time you have a new disease.
Right.
There should be an existing system that allows you to measure when disease comes in and track it over time. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect is, this is a disease where a lot of control is going to come from the way people behave.
Hmm.
So if you think about prevention of disease or prevention of transmission, what you need is a healthcare system that gives you the right messages at the right time. And that's only going to happen if you trust the system.
Right.
So how many of us go to a government hospital right now when we are sick?
Yeah.
If it's not AIMS, we don't go there,
Exactly.
right? How do you build a healthcare system that everybody in the country trusts?
Right.
You do that by building out quality healthcare from the primary health
Right.
centers. If you have that, you will build a system that the bulk of the population can trust, so that when there is messaging about behavior, about interventions, about access, which, as we discussed, is a key reason why people who come to hospitals seem to die earlier,
Right.
right? If they are severely ill, they come late.
Right.
Now, that can only be countered by having a healthcare system that we believe will give us the services that we need.
And it's not necessarily a matter of enormous investments. Sometimes it can just be innovations, right?
So I think for a lot of healthcare, and investment in prevention is very important.
Right.
And as I said, in this case, a lot of prevention is about behavior.
Yeah.
It's about wearing masks. It's about washing hands. It's about staying away from people. How
Right.
do you build a system where, when the healthcare system tells you to do this, you do this voluntarily,
Right.
not as is happening now when you are forced or fined or, beaten to comply?
Do you think we've learned our lesson from the lockdown, or have we just gone back as a society to our bad old ways?
I think it varies by location and by stratum of society. I think messaging matters a lot, and I'm not sure that people have received the messages that we wanted to deliver. There's a difference between persuasion and force.
Right.
And when you persuade people to adopt certain behaviors, those tend to be longer lasting changes than if it is something that is imposed on you.
Right. Doctor, tell me a little about you personally. Are you back in Vellore, and what are you working on currently?
So I am back in Vellore
You're
and back
delighted
to,
to be back home.
yes, it's good to be with my family again. It's been a long time away,
How long?
but
About 2 years or
four
more?
years.
4 years. So they
Yes.
must be happy to have you back.
I don't know if they are more troubled by me being always on their case or happy to have me back, but I'm certainly happy to be here with them.
Right. And what are you working on right now?
So we are continuing our work on rotavirus. We are actually now also working, a colleague of mine is leading some work on typhoid,
Right.
and it's incredible how much disease we are missing. We're
Okay.
starting a new program on maternal and child health that is in remote parts of the country. And then we are also thinking about how to approach the question of reinfections in COVID.
Right. You talked about typhoid. What are we missing there?
Just how much disease there is.
There is.
We had this hypothesis that because everybody has rampant use of
Yeah.
antibiotics in the community, and because blood cultures are not frequently done when people have a fever, we actually were missing a lot of typhoid.
Okay.
And we've done over the last 4 years this very large study across the entire country to see how much we were missing.
Oh,
And the WHO actually defines a country as being highly endemic for typhoid when there are more than 200 cases a year per 100,000 child years of follow-up. In our case, we are finding that we are over 1,000
wow.
cases of typhoid per
Oh,
100,000 child years of follow-up. So 5 times what WHO calls highly endemic.
God.
We have a vaccine, we don't use it. It's
Right.
in the private healthcare system. It's been there for 5 years. And the public health system, which is where the kids who get the sickest with typhoid, doesn't use the vaccine.
What can we do to make it available and to spread this message that while we continue the fight against COVID, typhoid is an equally big public health emergency?
I think the only thing to do is to continue to communicate with government.
Right.
There are lots of issues with, again, I told you about vertical systems for surveillance.
Yeah.
And we built one for rotavirus, we built one for typhoid,
Right.
the countries built one for COVID. We're thinking about influenza. We have some level of surveillance, but not really the kind of community-based studies we need. So it would be wonderful to have integrated systems in the country where we could do multiple things and be prepared for the next new thing that comes along.
How to make the typhoid vaccine available to people who really, really need it?
That those are decisions that need to be made by the National Technical Advisory Group on Immunizations, and I hope that we will be able to make the case. In Pakistan, in fact, was an outbreak 3 years ago of an almost completely drug-resistant typhoid. They also have the same problem of
Right,
widespread antibiotic usage,
right,
and they had an extensively drug-resistant strain of typhoid, which infected people, killed hundreds of people. And they have now introduced the vaccine in their routine immunization program. In India, I'm not sure that it would be possible to do it countrywide, but at least in the locations where we can predict typhoid is going to
right,
be high,
right,
we should be doing it. And cities are at risk.
right. And it perhaps kills more people than COVID?
We think that the mortality is pretty high. I think COVID this year is likely to be more.
Right,
It's currently heading to be more than even TB.
yeah.
But over time, we need to solve a lot of different problems.
With scientists such as you who know so much, I feel that you don't want to scare people too much and not, tell people exactly how much you know. But really, thank you so much for spending this time to educate us and to make us understand that this is something that we have to live with. We just have to be smart about the way we go about our lives and to actually practice what we have been told to do. Isn't that right?
That's right.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kang, for spending time with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Kaveri.